Every other war in American history, the government sent its citizens a bill. Taxes went up. People bought war bonds. Everyone sacrificed something. But when America launched the War on Terror, it did the opposite. It told its citizens to go shopping. This was the first war since the American Revolution paid for almost entirely on borrowed money. No war taxes, no war bonds, no rationing, just debt. And that single decision is the reason a war people think cost $2 trillion has actually cost $8 trillion and is still getting more expensive today, years after it ended. This is the war that never came due. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. To understand how strange this was, you have to remember how America used to pay for its wars. If you saw the World War II video, you know the drill. Back then, the government asked everyone to sacrifice. Income taxes reached almost every worker, with top rates as high as 94%. Around 85 million Americans, over half the entire country, bought war bonds to lend the government money. People rationed gasoline, sugar, meat, rubber. Paying for the war was a shared national project that everyone could feel in their daily life. That had been the American way of war for generations. You want to fight? The whole country pays. Together. Right now. Then came September 11, 2001, and everything about that model was thrown out. Because in the days after the attacks, the president did not ask Americans to sacrifice. He asked them to carry on as normal, to travel, to fly, to take their families to Disney World, to keep spending and enjoying life. The message was that the best way to defy the terrorists was to refuse to let them disrupt the American way of life. And taken purely as a morale message, in a moment of shock and fear, that's not unreasonable. But it quietly extended into something much bigger. It became the blueprint for how the entire war would be paid for. Which is to say, it wouldn't be, not by the people living through it. A small slice of the country would go and fight. Everyone else was asked to do essentially nothing. Go about your lives. Go shopping. Hold on to that phrase, go shopping, because it's the key to the whole financial story, and it's about to cost $8 trillion. Here's where it gets genuinely unprecedented. In every major war before this, when the government needed money, it raised taxes to help pay for the fighting. The War on Terror did the exact reverse. In 2001, and again in 2003, just as the United States was invading Iraq, the government cut taxes. Read that again. The country launched two simultaneous wars and lowered taxes at the same time. Federal tax revenue actually shrank as a share of the economy, falling from around 19% of the nation's output in 2001 to about 16% by 2020, while war spending piled up on top. So if you're not paying for a war with taxes and you're not raising money with bonds, where does the money come from? There's only one answer left. You borrow every dollar of it. And that is precisely what happened. For the first time since the Revolutionary War more than 2 centuries earlier, America funded a war almost entirely with debt. And this brings us to a pattern that should sound familiar. Think back to the American Revolution video. The last time America paid for a war entirely on credit, the money it printed became so worthless it birthed the phrase, "not worth a continental." 200 years later, America did the credit-funded war again, just with a more sophisticated tool. Instead of printing paper, it borrowed from global markets, quietly, on a scale no one was forced to notice. Quick pause. This is exactly what this channel is built for, the money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now how they hid a war this expensive in plain sight. Because the borrowing was designed to be invisible. Normally, government spending goes through the regular annual budget, where it gets debated, scrutinized, and fought over. But the post-9/11 wars were funded largely through separate emergency spending bills, special war appropriations passed outside the normal budget process, quickly and with far less oversight. Money flowed through what critics later nicknamed a ghost budget, vast sums approved with minimal public debate, minimal transparency, and minimal accountability. The war had its own hidden financial plumbing, running alongside the regular government, out of sight of most citizens. And the timing made it almost painless to pull off. The 2000s and 2010s were an era of historically low interest rates and enormous global demand for U.S. government debt. The whole world wanted to lend money to America. Remember from the earlier videos, the dollar sits at the center of global finance, so U.S. Treasury bonds are the safest asset on Earth. That meant the government could borrow trillions of dollars cheaply without pushing up interest rates or squeezing the economy in any way ordinary people would feel. No new taxes, no bonds to buy, no rationing, no pain. The war was happening thousands of miles away, funded by money borrowed from the future. And for most Americans, daily life didn't change at all. And that is exactly the problem. Because a war you can't feel is a war you stop questioning, and a credit card, no matter how low the interest rate, always comes due eventually. So let's talk about the real number. When people think of the war on terror, they might picture a cost of maybe $2 trillion, the rough price of the fighting itself in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that number captures only a fraction of the truth. According to the Costs of War project at Brown University, the most thorough accounting anyone has done, the true cost of the post-9/11 wars runs to at least $8 trillion. $8 trillion. That is a sum larger than the entire annual economic output of Japan and Germany combined. So how do you get from $2 trillion in fighting to $8 trillion in total? You add up all the pieces that the credit card approach conveniently kept out of sight. There's the direct war spending in Afghanistan and Pakistan, around $2.3 trillion. There's Iraq and Syria, roughly $2.1 trillion. There's the more than $1 trillion spent building up the Department of Homeland Security to prevent attacks at home. There's the hundreds of billions added to the Pentagon's baseline budget because of the wars. And then are the two categories that truly explode the total, the two costs that come from borrowing instead of paying. First, interest. Because every dollar of this war was borrowed, the government has already spent over $1 trillion just on interest payments on the war debt. Money that buys no weapons, no security, nothing except the privilege of having borrowed. And second, the veterans. Caring for the men and women who fought these wars, their medical care, their disability benefits, for the rest of their lives is projected to cost well over $2 trillion, most of which has not been paid yet. And that last point unlocks the strangest fact about this whole war. Remember I told you it's still getting more expensive years after it ended? This is why. The war on terror officially wound down. America pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021. But its single largest cost, caring for its veterans, is still mostly ahead of us. Because a soldier wounded at 25 will need care for 50 or 60 years. The bills for physical injuries, for trauma, for disability, don't peak while the war is being fought. They peak decades later. History proves it. Think back to the very first video on this channel, the Civil War. The last Civil War pension was still being paid out in the year 2020 to the daughter of a veteran 155 years after the war ended. The costs of caring for those who fight stretch across generations. For the war on terror, the Veterans Care Bill is projected to keep climbing until around 2050 and beyond. Add in the compounding interest on all that debt, and the full lifetime cost of these wars could ultimately reach $12 to $14 trillion. A war that ended in 2021 will still be sending America invoices when today's children are middle-aged. And the human cost runs underneath the financial one, and it doesn't fit on any balance sheet. Around 7,000 American service members were killed in the fighting itself, but the toll didn't stop when they came home. By some estimates, roughly 30,000 post-9/11 veterans have been lost to suicide, around 4 times the number killed in combat. Nearly 1 million people in total are estimated to have died as a direct result of these wars, the vast majority of them civilians, with tens of millions more driven from their homes. These are the costs that never appear in any budget line, and they are, by far, the heaviest. There's one more piece to this, and it reframes where all that money actually went. Because a huge share of it didn't go to soldiers or to the government at all, it went to private companies. More than half of the war spending flowed to private contractors, firms that provided security, logistics, construction, meals, fuel, intelligence, and consulting. In just 5 recent years, private firms received well over $2 trillion in Pentagon contracts, more than half of all the department's discretionary spending. The War on Terror wasn't only a military campaign. It was one of the largest transfers of taxpayer money to private industry in modern history, and a staggering amount of that money simply vanished into waste. Government auditors who tracked the reconstruction of Afghanistan and Iraq documented tens of billions of dollars lost to fraud, mismanagement, and projects that failed or were never finished. Roads that crumbled, power plants that never ran, schools that existed only on paper. There were even ghost soldiers in the Afghan army, tens of thousands of names on the payroll drawing salaries, soldiers who did not actually exist, invented so that commanders could pocket the pay. The money was flowing so fast through such a hidden and lightly supervised system that vast sums could disappear without anyone back home noticing a thing. When nobody feels the bill, nobody watches the till. And that raises the question of opportunity cost. What else that money could have done? Economists estimate that $1 million spent on the military creates around 5 jobs, while the same million spent on education creates about 13, and in healthcare around 9. $8 trillion is a number so large it's almost meaningless, but it's worth asking what a fraction of it, invested at home instead, might have built. So here is the whole arc, and it closes a story this channel has been telling across every video. America used to pay for its wars the way it did in World War II. Everyone taxed, half the country buying bonds, the whole nation sacrificing together, and out of that shared effort came the most broadly prosperous society the world had ever seen. The War on Terror was the opposite in every way. It was fought by a tiny sliver of the population, paid for by no one living at the time, and quietly loaded onto the national credit card to be settled by future generations who had no say in it. No taxes, no bonds, no sacrifice, just go shopping. And that, in the end, is the real lesson buried in the $8 trillion bill. The deepest danger of putting a war on a credit card isn't just the debt or even the interest. It's that when a nation no longer feels the cost of its wars, when there's no tax, no bond, no rationing, nothing to make an ordinary citizen stop and notice, then there's nothing left to make anyone ask the most important question of all. Is this war worth what it costs? A country that can fight without feeling the price can fight almost forever. And that may be the most expensive consequence of all. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money, and the War on Terror is the one where America learned to fight without ever sending its people the bill, so the bill simply never stopped growing. If you made it this far, you're exactly who war economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.